All right. Well, hey, welcome to On This Hill, a podcast of Church on the Hill. Bruce, we started here recently talking about what time is this? What time are we in?
Yeah, what time are we in?
Yeah, where do we live? How you feeling?
Oh, these are interesting times, without question. I mean, the things, just the last few weeks, current events, the last few weeks, we have wildfires, and we have an election looming on the horizon. We have unrest in all different parts of the world, and we have we're pastoring a church in the midst of it all, 2023. So it's interesting.
Yeah, with my kids, I was thinking about how we, we're all at different ages, but we're all living through the same time. Yeah. But so we experience it differently because of our experience and age and how much we've gone through or not gone through. So our real little one will be like, how much does this really affect him? He's not reading the news. He's not paying attention to what's happening. Mom and dad are taking care of him. Life is great. But then my, Grace and Faith are 21, about to be 21, 22. And they're more now, they're in the world. They're watching the news. They're paying attention to what's happening. But they're seeing it through this young lens that hasn't ever seen anything like this before. To them, everything is, this is the first time this has ever happened, or this is the worst it's ever been, or they just don't have a track record.
The sky is falling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where I'm 51, so a little bit ahead of them, 30 years ahead of them, and thinking, well, I guess I've seen some of this before, and I've read in history some of this before. So we're all going through the same time, but we're doing it differently.
Yeah, it's funny, history. It's interesting when you were talking just recently, depending on when you're listening to this, in this past week, Los Angeles had a tropical storm. The first tropical storm they've had in close to, I think it was 70 years.
Yeah, a few decades, yeah.
So there's a whole generation of people that say, a tropical storm where I live? That's not possible, but it was. Yeah. And then in the midst of the tropical storm, there's an earthquake. Yeah. And so you'd think it would make you, at least it's talked about, like, wow, what's going on, what's happening? Again, climate change is a big discussion, a very real thing, I think, and fires and earthquakes and famines. And, Jesus said in Matthew that he said that there's going to come a season and times when those things are going to be more frequent.
Yeah, it's a great example because that's the kind of thing, like, you don't want to just take it day by day or even decade by decade. Like in this case, you have to go back several decades to see, okay, this has happened before, like a tropical storm. It's possible here. It's just not frequent. So if you're new to the area, you may think, oh no, there's something like this is unprecedented. Well, it does have precedence. It just is in a slow cycle. And I think that could be true culturally as well and spiritually. Culture, I don't know if culture changes super fast. I think people are saying, and I would tend to agree with them, that culture is changing quicker than it ever has because of communication.
Information
We
power.
used to be isolated, and it took a while for news to get anywhere. There's old movies about a guy who would move into, roll through town just to read the news to people. Where now we get it instantly on our phone. I get a ding on my iPad, and it tells me what just happened.
Or influencers. I remember growing up in Chicago, and you could watch literally fads and new things take off. They originated in New York, then they jumped all the way across the country to Los Angeles because of the connection there, and then they would get to the Midwest. They would never started in the Midwest, but it always ended up there because sooner or later it got to us. You could just see it, especially in the 70s, just stuff that was, whether it was music or art forms or things like that.
Yeah, even politically, if you think about this experiment in democracy and freedom that we're in here in America, we think, in our lifetime, like, oh, it's been like this forever, but it hasn't. No. We're pretty new on the block when it comes to countries and a way of doing life. But all that to get to, like, spiritually, what does that cycle look like, and where are we right now? Is this a wave we're on? Is this a trend we're hitting right now? What time is this? And what times can we look forward to in the future?
A word I think of more than a wave is a tide. A tide is a movement of waves. It's a movement of something. You think about it as big as the ocean, pulled by gravitational forces and so forth. And a tide goes in and a tide goes out, and you can't observe it actually. Right. It's a slow move, but it's a definite move. If you sit there long enough, you can see literally the edge of the water, recede and so forth and so on. But I think spiritually, it's the same thing, same principle, I guess. That there's certain moods maybe in a culture, and then passions come up and so forth. I think things will speed it up. like we saw in the last few years with all the conflict and so forth in a culture around injustice or racism or activism or things like that. But I think there's definitely a mood. And I'm slow to use words that define a generation like millennials or Gen Z, but for the sake of this conversation, I think there's something going on, and different people have documented this of people being disillusioned with the faith. People who are like, well, you know what, I used to believe this, but now I believe that. And we touched on this a few weeks ago when we talked about deconstruction.
Yeah, because there's something behind that. People don't just deconstruct for no reason.
Right.
Like if you're in your house and you decide, you start to get discontent maybe with something about your house. Like, how come when I'm in the kitchen I can't see anybody or talk to anybody? And then you watch Joanna Gaines. You're like, open floor plan.
Yeah.
So suddenly, like, you're disillusioned. This house that you paid good money for, you become
I want one of those giant showers. And
I'm unhappy with this place now. And so you start to knock down walls and change things. Yeah. And so I think that disillusionment word is what's actually maybe behind the deconstruction word. Because when we start to deconstruct, we've thought, I don't know if this belongs here. Maybe I should take it out. And some of that's fair, but some of it, you better know what you're doing. You know, there's a reason why. As much as I hate permits and red tape and everything that goes along with it, I also think maybe not everyone should just wire their own home.
Yeah.
You know, maybe there's a reason why steps should have this much of a rise and roofs should be at this angle and all of that, you know. And
they ask good questions. Typically, someone with the information, the right information is going to ask. Yeah. They may be bothersome questions, but actually that was a good question. Yeah, thanks.
But get back to the disillusionment piece. Like what have people become disillusioned by? What's behind that? What's make people, you know, do these moves? And some of them radical moves where they're leaving faith, they're leaving community, they're leaving family, some of them, because of what they no longer believe or become disillusioned by.
I was reflecting on this earlier today and yesterday, actually the last few days. I get sometimes there's like I don't know, I just have a series of conversations with people that have kind of a common theme. This theme has been common for the last few weeks with me. Not sure why, but just people expressing disillusionment. And I love to go to Webster's so that the words we're talking about have some clarity. Here's what Webster says about disillusionment. He said, it's a feeling of disappointment resulting from the discovery that something is not as good as one believed it to be.
You know what that reminds me of? All the marriage counseling that we do. Like, all the times we try our best to go in with someone, premarital specifically, because, you know, not as good as one believed it to be.
Right.
When you're in love and all the chemicals are flowing, and I mean, you just believe this is going to be the best thing that's ever happened to you.
Yeah.
But then when you get into it, there is a certain amount, natural disillusionment that just happens. Like, oh, you are just a person.
Yeah.
Like all the other people that I know. And I think it's particularly interesting to me because I'll see this a lot of times with guys, honestly, who are kind of gruff. I don't like anybody. I don't like, you know, I don't like people. I don't like, you know, I just keep my head down, do my work, and leave me alone. But man, this woman, man, I love this woman. This woman's amazing. And then they get married and they realize, oh, this woman's a people.
Right.
That thing I don't like.
Personality,
Yeah. I married one of them.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes God tricks us into that because he's not really good with us just not liking his creation. But there's just a disillusionment that often happens in marriage.
We talked last Sunday at our Kaiser campus, and I brought something out in the message about how has our current culture sort of played into this in the sense of just this mentality of the customer is king, have it your way, you deserve a break today. This very much playing to the idea that you deserve the ideal experience. I think you see it a little bit of people looking for the perfect cup of coffee.
Yeah.
This is the perfect, this is the killer burger, right? This is, I'm looking for this experience that's going to, or this formula of some kind where I'm never going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
You know, it's never going to be a poor product.
This is funny, but what it reminds me of is I listened to a podcast several years ago now. I think it was on This American Life, but they were talking about a few of the stores that will take back any return.
Yeah.
Any return. REI, I think, was one of them, and there's another one, the big one I can't think of. But they were talking about the people that work the desk and how they have to be trained to be like someone will return a pair of boots that have just been worn through. They're just completely worn through, and they just have to be trained to just smile.
Customer's king.
Yeah, hey, is there any reason why you're unhappy with these? Like, oh, they just don't fit right. Like, oh. And they just have to smile and say, okay, thank you, and put it on a shelf and give them their refund or their brand new pair of boots.
So that's the intriguing question, I guess I understand why a company would do that, because it makes for return customers. Back in the day, people always bought Craftsman tools because you could use them for years and break them and get a brand new one. So it makes sense. But has it fostered sort of this idea that I am the king? Yeah. And I don't deserve anything that is not up to my liking or my standard. And if I am disappointed, I'm going to deconstruct it. And so I think, and of course we're two pastors sitting here, but I think that has played out in people's approach to faith and the kingdom of God, and even Jesus himself. I think, there's been books that have been written and of course data that's been collected that sounds like, well, they love Jesus, but they don't love the church. Well, it's like, okay, so I've been disillusioned in church. I've been disappointed by people, which that shouldn't surprise us, or right? Or is that fair? Or
well, the first thing I think of is Jesus, and going from a perfect place in community with the Father and the Holy Spirit to us, and what did that feel like? And then to die for us. And then we're the bride, and how does he feel about it? Does he ever, what does he feel about it? And yet he never gives up. His grace is never ending. He never stops loving us as the bride of Christ, as the church, as community. But I've talked to a lot of people that have stopped. Stop loving the bride, stop loving the church. And sometimes, they can articulate it in a clear way and say, well, it's not the church, it's the American church,
right?
And I don't mind hearing that. I understand. I think you and I have had a lot of conversations about this, like, oh, what are we doing wrong? How do we do this right?
How can we be better?
Yeah, and I don't believe that our culture gets it perfectly right. Sometimes when we visit in mission trips, other cultures, and you see church, you're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Like, how could we incorporate this, or is that just for that culture? And But I do think there's something that puts at the center my hopes and feelings and expectations are what's important. And if they're not met, then I'm out because it's about me. And to be fair, I think a lot of those people, that's the way the gospel was sold to them.
Yeah.
So when it didn't work out, they were like, well, you sold me a bill of goods. You lied to me. You told me that when I came to Christ, I would find a loving community that always accepted me. Yeah. That my life would get better, that my needs would be met, that my emotions would level out, that my marriage would improve, that people, and sometimes that's the way the gospel is presented. Come to Jesus and your life will improve. And that's not obviously what the gospel actually says. And so when that reality doesn't appear the next week after salvation, or even the next year after salvation, they go, well, this isn't untrue. Someone told me something not true, and so I don't believe this anymore.
That's so good. Think about just what you were talking about earlier in the realm of marriage, right? Yeah. I mean, it would seem like I just did a wedding this past weekend, and they did a little game during the reception. Who's been married the longest? We've all seen that, and the people that won the prize had been married for 58 years, and it was obvious they loved each other. But if you talked to them, it was also obvious they were real human beings. Yeah. And he joked oftentimes about, some of the conflict they might have had. But is it a thing of, is it seasonal in a maturing process that in the early stages of a marriage, I do see what's wrong in my mate, or I do see maybe not what's wrong or what I don't like or what I didn't see, what I was blind to. And then I have to make some decisions about whether I'm going to, work through this, whether I'm going to learn new skills, whether I'm going to, how I'm going to respond. Am I going to respond selfishly and so forth?
Yeah, well, when you think about the binding contract and the ceremony, to love, honor, in sickness and health,
poverty and wealth, so on and so forth.
You're trying your best to, like a contract that's written, to say, okay, in case of this provision, we'll do this. In case of this, we'll do that. But this contract says, I'm never going to
I'm never taking the boots back.
Ethan, add the Rickroll here. I'm never going to give you up. Never going to let you down. Never going to run around and desert you. That's what we're saying. We're saying, hey, no matter what, I'm in this.
Yeah.
And so then when you get into marriage, you don't really expect sickness. You don't expect poverty. You don't expect those things to happen. And you live long enough. That couple's married how many years?
58.
If you're married 58 years, you're going to go through some of those things.
Yeah.
And you have to go back to I did say that. Am I going to stand by that or not? And it's made me wonder at times, obviously don't hold me to this, it's just kind of a thought experiment, but what if we did that in the church in a way and said, okay, you want to marry Jesus. You want to be saved. Yeah. Okay, love, honor, obey in sickness and health. Till death do us part. Like, is that what you're saying? Yeah. And can you say, I do?
Whether I like what's going on or not. Yeah. I mean, think about what you just said, how powerful that idea is. This commitment that holds steady in spite of the circumstances that I may feel are adverse or unfair or unjust, right? Dietrich Bonhoeffer has this great line. He says, if we're lucky, we will experience a profound sense of disillusionment with Christians in general. And if we're fortunate, with ourselves. You know, so I was thinking about that. What he was saying is like, he said, sooner or later, we're going to hit the reality that everybody around me is a fallen human being. But then the next piece is, I think what's critical is like, and you know what? Me too. Don't you think that makes for great community? Like, hey, don't come join a perfect group of people. Come join an imperfect group of people, fallen in nature, hopeless sinners without Jesus, and we're all on this journey together. And on the journey, we're going to have a lot of fun, but we also might have a lot of struggles. We also might not meet all the expectations we would like. We might not all perform the way you'd hope, but I'm part of this fallen group, right? There's a humility thing there, I think.
No, 100%. I can't help but that quote, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you said?
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, yeah.
Who, I mean, understood community really well.
And experienced the worst
of humanity. It totally reminds me of something somebody told me years ago after going through something really hard in a Christian organization. I mean, I was not sleeping at night. It was conflict, it was relationship, it was hard. And this guy, you know, helping us kind of walk through it when we finally kind of brought it to a close, he goes, hey, Jason, you know, how you doing? You know, what are you feeling? I said, mostly I'm feeling disillusioned. I said, I'm really disappointed in the way this all went down and the way I thought people would behave and the way I thought this institution would handle it. And he looked at me and he goes, that's great. Yeah. He's like, that's really good. That's a good place to be. He said, don't let go of that. Pay attention to that. And at first I'm like, are you wanting me to quit? I didn't get what he meant. But what he meant was, you know, good. You had too many things on too high a pedestals. And they needed to be down on ground level. They needed to be where actually you could see everything about them and not just, you know, an idealized version of them, which is what we tend to marry. We marry an idealized version of the person, not the person. Sometimes that's because they presented an idealized version of themselves. Like, here's me on time. Here's me dressed up. Here's me, you know, on point and in good behavior. But I think we can do the same thing in organization, in community, and then it's good to then sometimes lose that and go, oh, I expected something from people that I could actually only get from God. I expected behavior from people that I could only get from God. I expected care from people that I could only get from God. Yeah. And so it's good.
In other words, I put too much weight in people.
So now it's actually really good that I no longer feel like I should get that from Bruce Stefanik or from any leader. I'm like, oh no, he can't provide what I actually need. Now, he's a part of God's provision. You're a part of God's provision, but you can't be the ultimate.
I think people, I'm reminded of a conversation I had in one of the marriage classes we ran, and this couple had been married about 10 years. And so they weren't novices, but, you know, 10 years isn't a long time in the grand scheme of things, but it's an investment of time. And she said to me, I said, what's one thing you maybe have learned, you know, in the 10 years? And I'll never forget, she just looked at me super intense and sincere and said, marriage is hard. And I thought, and she was just being very upfront and honest. And I said, yeah, it is. Yeah. But it was almost like that was a surprise to her. But she had wrapped her mind around it. She wasn't like, this is hard and I'm quitting, or this is hard, oh, woe is me. She wasn't whining, but she was arriving at a truth. Like, marriage is hard. And of course, the conversation was a lot broader than that, but did you expect no hardness? Did you expect all easy? Did you expect nothing but? And so has our culture sort of fed this, especially in the North American church, where nothing should be hard, everything should be easy? And then just this last Sunday, we talked about, in a lot of cultures, both ancient and modern, to become a believer, to become a follower of Jesus actually increases the hardness, increases the difficulty, it makes life more complex. In some countries, you lose jobs or you lose family to be a follower of Jesus. Is that fair? You know?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe pull the curtain back just a little bit and say we just came out of a pastor's meeting where we sat around in a circle with other pastors. We're reading a book right now, but we're just conversing about the work and the ministry and praying for one another. And one of the things I said was, sometimes I wish I could make church attendance harder. Yeah,
raise the bar instead of lower.
Yeah, and I know that's not necessarily a good idea. But there's this feeling like if you just had to come at 5 a.m., it would weed out people that are just looking for,
consumer Christianity.
Yeah, consumer Christianity. But again, we're not changing church times to make things harder. We're not, putting in wooden benches instead of soft chairs to make it uncomfortable for you.
Kneelers in front of the chairs.
Yeah, there's no reason why we should have to produce this. But what we should do is talk about the reality that doing the right thing, serving Jesus, dying to self is painful. And if you're not feeling pain, maybe you're not on the cross. Yeah. If you're not hurting at all in this walk, it actually might not be a sign that you're doing everything exactly right, which is sometimes what's said, like, oh, you shouldn't feel any pain. You shouldn't be sick. You shouldn't be poor.
Uncomfortable.
If you're a believer, you should have all that taken care of. I think the scriptures is just the opposite. That if more how do I say this? Maybe a better indication of whether or not you're in the will of God might be that, oh, I am suffering, so I might be doing the right thing right now. I might be in the right place right now, because this is going against the flesh. This is not what I feel like doing today, serving children.
Yeah.
Or handing out backpacks like we did on Friday, or doing the ICU event. Like, I'd rather be home.
Forgiving somebody or sitting next to somebody that I don't get along with, or that's not my political persuasion, or any number of things, right? I look back over the years, the decades in ministry, both in this country and outside the country, and you see certain tides maybe, or movements of things that originated for the most part in North America, like the prosperity gospel, or like the seeker-sensitive movement, where we're trying to and maybe there's a kernel of truth in most of them. I think there is that, we want to be sensitive to seekers, but there's a big difference between that and being a seeker-sensitive church, that we have done an injustice to the gospel itself by setting people up for disappointment. And then, and I think it kind of comes full circle back to this basic question about disillusionment, because I think some people are not just disillusioned with the church or with its people, but they're disillusioned with God himself. They really feel like, God, you're doing a pretty poor job of running the universe. Do you see what's going on here? Yeah. But does that go back to like expectations as well? Like, well, that's not how I would. If God was, if God was God, if God could stop the suffering and doesn't, it's the age-old question, right? And he doesn't, why doesn't he? Is he just or loving?
If people haven't read the book, I'd recommend it, honestly, highly, although the title is disturbing, Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey.
Yeah, it's great it's a classic.
Yeah, it is. Book. Yeah, it's a classic. I'm not saying it contains all the answers to that question, but it grapples with it, and I think a lot of people don't want to. They don't want to think about. They're afraid to be disappointed with God. And the reality is most of us get disappointed with God over the years. It just happens.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's because, well, I thought you'd be here when I was sick, or I thought, how come they died?
Martha and Mary and Lazarus, where were you? If you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died.
That's disappointment with God. And I think we all go through it, but not all of us walk out the other side still with a faith intact. And the two kind of pieces of faith too. There's faith of what I believe, but then there's just faithfulness. Have I stayed faithful to him even though he's disappointed me? Admitting that he's disappointed me. Admitting I thought God would be like this in this situation, and he wasn't. Yeah. I prayed for healing, or I prayed for this, or I prayed for salvation, or whatever. I prayed for it. And I thought, a good God, how could you be good and all-powerful and not answer that request? I can't wrap my head around you being good. So now I have to deal with maybe you're not good, or maybe my idea of good isn't the same idea of good as yours. And am I going to remain faithful to you, even though it seems to me like you're in the wrong here? I mean,
the book of Job.
I was just going to say, after you read Discipline with God, please read the book of Job, because he makes a strong argument with God for himself.
Yeah, yeah.
And in the end, God doesn't say, how dare you ask those things of me? As a matter of fact, he says to Job's friends, this Job has not sinned in anything he said, but you guys have. And so I want you guys to make sacrifices, and Job I'm going to bless.
But it's fascinating how the book of Job ends, because what God does for Job, right, is he pulls back the curtain just a little bit and says, where were you when I laid the foundations? Where were you when I caused the morning star? Where were you, you know? So what God does is he in a way, he pulls, not just pulls back the curtain, but he pulls back the whole perspective and says, Job, yes, you're suffering in your small world, and that suffering is real. And of course, there's questions that aren't answered about the book of Job, but I think the gist of it is that God is in charge of his world. And so that brings up this question, maybe, we can wrap it up here, but is Jesus, is the gospel, when we look at all the other offerings out there, whether those are other religions of Buddhism or Islam or whatever it would be, or maybe it's just raw materialism.
Right.
Listen, there is no God. I've walked away from my faith, and it's just me, and it's just this real world I'm living in, and when you're dead, you're dead. But is Jesus still the best hope of all the answers?
Yeah.
Are the words, the teachings of Jesus, the promises of Jesus, even though there are pieces of it that we don't understand, that we're disappointed, that it's not working the way we thought it should or the way we expected, is Jesus Christ and the message of the gospel still the best hope of a modern world and of a broken world, a fallen world? I don't know, because I've often said from the front, if you have a better hope and a better answer, I'd love the dialogue about that.
Yeah, I think, I would just say personally, I can't help. I keep thinking back to Trisha and I. At a time we went through 10 years of infertility, praying every day for something, and having to live in that tension of, I love God, but I really don't love his answer right now.
Yeah.
I believe he's good, but this does not feel good. And at one point we got to the place where we actually asked God, can we quit asking for a baby? Because honestly, it's making us bitter. Because we're asking for something that you're not giving us, and it would be easier to stop asking, because then I can just let it go. Well, I just can let it go. And the crazy thing was, in all of that, we felt like we heard God say, "Don't stop asking." I'm like, okay, I don't understand this. But now that we've been married 31 years and not 10, I look back and I'm like, oh God, I wouldn't trade that time for anything.
Yeah.
What you taught me during that time, like if I would have just walked away and said, well, the God I thought, hey, he's not the God who is, because he's not good. Yeah. He didn't treat us good, or he let us down. If I'd have walked away then, I think of the life I'd miss right now and everything he's done for us. Because we were disappointed, but we just, and I'm not saying we're better than anybody else, but we just couldn't give up. I knew him. And when you know someone, even if you can't understand them, you just keep giving them more and more. Like if you said, hey, I just need you to do something for me I can't explain right now. I know enough of your character. I'd do it for you, right? And you're just a friend.
Right.
But God is the God of the universe, and he was asking that of me, and he'd shown himself so good in every other place. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't make any sense to me, but you've shown yourself so good to me in my salvation. Far be it for me to walk away from you, because I haven't seen you in my biology.
Yeah.
So I'll hang in there.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating that the very question you're describing is going back to the start of this time together, is the same question husbands and wives have to ask. Hey, we married each other because we believed that we were two good-willed people who genuinely love. I've never done a wedding ceremony where people were uncertain about that.
Yeah.
You know, they always say,
two people that didn't like
promise,
each other.
I do, yeah. Not, I hope this works. This is going to work. But what happens is, in the midst of turmoil or dark times or tragedy or whatever, the question comes up, well, maybe you're not good. Yeah. And sometimes the answer is, well, yeah, you're not acting very good right now. Or this is why the gospel is so redemptive. But, hey, I believe that change is possible, that good is possible because of the power of the gospel. And then with God, it's even on an entirely different plane, that, God, there's things I don't understand, and I may never understand. The curtain might never get pulled back like it did for Job. But, God, I believe at the end of the day, you are good, and you are the hope for a fallen man and a fallen culture.
Well, we haven't really done this before, but I just feel like there's people listening that are in this right now, that are struggling with disillusionment and disappointment, and they don't just need apologetics to tell them why they shouldn't be.
Right.
I feel like they need prayer. Can we just pray for them?
And for some people listening right now, you know what? This may be a healthy end and a new beginning.
Yeah.
Because maybe the God that you have served or endeavored to serve or believed in is really partially the God of your imagination. So maybe this disillusionment is something that I just lay down and say, God, you know what? I want to know you and who you really are, not in who I expect you to be. And it could be a whole new beginning for somebody.
Yeah, Father, I don't claim to know everyone who's listening to this right now, but you do. There's not a person sitting in a car with headphones in or fixing dinner listening to this right now that you don't know their name and that you haven't died for. And so, God, I pray for that person that's struggling right now with the pain of disappointment. Maybe they've been disappointed by other believers or a community, a system, or maybe they feel ultimately disappointed in you. Holy Spirit, I just ask, would you get all the way into that pain? As deep as the pain is gone, as deep as the wound is, Holy Spirit, would your healing get in there? I know that they might not find any answer right now, but I pray you that are listening would find the presence of God. And I know when I've experienced the presence of God, the answers don't mean as much as the person of Jesus. And so, Father, would you show up in presence, in indwelling or filling of the Holy Spirit in each of those people that are hurting right now. Yeah.
Amen.
Amen. Well, folks, we love you. I hope we get to see you on Sunday and at all the places where we do in person. We just feel like Christianity is meant to be incarnational and not just technological. And so while we love these gifts of technology, we long to actually meet you and see you in person. Yeah. So show up on a Sunday and introduce yourself if you haven't yet. And if you think this might be a blessing to somebody else, pass it on.
Yeah. Have a great week and enjoy the summer.
Bye.